I really enjoy cooperative card games with limited communication. Games like Hanabi and The Mind distill an intense experience into a quick and affordable package. The Shipwreck Arcana from Meromorph Games is in a similar vein, having players give number clues to solve small logic puzzles. But does it sail into the upper echelons of this genre or crash upon the rocks? Let's find out and discuss 5 things about the Shipwreck Arcana. To start a turn of the Shipwreck Arcana, the active player draws 2 tiles from a token bag. They compare their fate tiles to 4 Arcana cards, seeing which ones have an if-then statement that applies to them, allowing them to place one of their fate tokens below the card. Once the active player has placed their tile, all the other tiles try to figure out, based on the if-then statements available, what the hidden tile that the player did not show might actually be. If they correctly predict the hidden fate of the active player, their score advances by 1. If instead they incorrectly predict, their doom advances by 1. Each fate tile has a number of hours on it from 1 to 3, corresponding to the number of moons on each Arcana card. When the number of fate tiles placed below an Arcana card equals or exceeds the number of moons, that card fades. A faded Arcana card is flipped, giving the players a one-time power they can use to help in their predictions. But if an Arcana card fades in a turn in which no correct prediction was made, Doom advances by 2. If they can get their score all the way to the 7 space before the Doom similarly advances to 7, they win the game. First, I'd like to discuss the components and art in the game, which are of a generally very high quality for such a low price point. The tiles and tokens in the game are all made of wood and have a nice chunky feel to them. But the standout is the art on the Arcana cards, which calls to mind really beautiful tarot decks. Another nice touch is the wooden number lines that each player has. As the other players discuss and determine what the active player's hidden tile might be, they can instruct them to turn over certain numbers, leaving only certain possibilities still open to them. This really helps to make the game much more accessible, removing any sort of memory element and giving players more information as they try to figure out one player's hidden tile over the course of several turns. We're following 2 pros with the con, and that's that the game does not work very well at high player counts. In my games with 2 or even 3 players, everyone tends to be fairly involved as they try to figure out the logic and discover which fate tile each player has. But when you cram 4 or 5 players into the mix, because the logic puzzles aren't that challenging, you'll often have at least 1 or 2 players who can kind of zone out and not really need to participate much. I'm next going to focus on the fading mechanic and the Arcana cards turning over and giving powers to the players. On the positive side, it's an interesting puzzle to figure out which tile to place where based on the number of hours you're going to use, possibly making a card fade and costing you doom. Additionally, the faded powers themselves are quite interesting. They become part of the entire logical puzzle, because a player playing a tile knows that that card is available, and thus you have to wonder, did they think I would use that to solve their tile? On the negative side though, because Doom advances by 2 if you don't correctly predict a tile on the turn a card fades, and does not advance at all if you do correctly predict it, but in either case you get the power to help your next prediction, you do get a bit of a rich get richer problem, where if you make a few lucky guesses, you're going to get more cards to help you make future guesses, and sometimes you'll railroad through the entire game with barely any challenge at all. My final point is the logic puzzle and the play of the tiles themselves, and this is unfortunately a bit of a mix. On the positive side, figuring out where to place your tiles and discussing with the other players where a tile might go can be really fun on some turns and can really lead to some interesting logical deductions, especially when some of the bonus cards are factored in. But on the negative side, and this can be a pretty big negative, too often the clues become incredibly simple for anybody to solve. Like here, if I play a 3 and it has to be at least 4 apart, I know that the other tile has to be a 7. And these kind of immediately solvable logic puzzles come up a little too often in the game for me. Combined with my previous point about the rich get richer problem, I've had a lot of very swingy games where we just won card after card and tile after tile without any challenge at all. And that's a bit discouraging, even though it doesn't happen every time you play the game. The Shipwreck Arcana was a bit of a tough one to review because I kept on going back and forth on it and also having very different play experiences with different groups. Playing with my wife or my design partner was generally a great experience with really intense, engaging gameplay throughout. But in other groups, especially when I played with 4 or 5 players, people felt disengaged and weren't really involved for a lot of the gameplay. So I'll say right off the bat, if you think you're going to mostly be playing this with 4 or 5 players, I might be a little cautious. I think there are better card games for you to play with that size of a group. The Shipwreck Arcana, for me, is really similar to Hanabi, another card game with limited communication and somewhat math-based clues to be given. My wife said she preferred the Shipwreck Arcana because it was more accessible and easy to get into at a moment's notice. But for me, I'm going to give the nod to Hanabi. The Shipwreck Arcana tends to have less interesting for me logic puzzles that often are a bit too simple to solve, and also has some issues with the difficulty and games being very swingy, being too hard or too easy depending on how the cards come out. Now, I don't want to give the impression that I don't like the game. I really do, and I'm considering backing it on the current Kickstarter that's going on for about another week. But I do want you to realize that it's not a perfect game for all sizes of groups, and it's not a perfect game for all types of gamers. So definitely be cautious as you consider pledging or not. Good gaming, everyone!